you can come back to it. Recording in progress. Okay. You can come back to it and watch it later. We will post these on the Lunch and Learn site, Lunch and Learn page, so that people can find them. So first of all, welcome. I am grateful that you're going to take this journey with me to learn something about the origins of Zionism. As I mentioned earlier, obviously Zionism is in the air a lot right now, perhaps more than it's been in the last, three-quarters of a century, because of what people are saying around the world about Israel. By the way, I'll make sure online you can hear me, correct? You can all hear me? Okay, great. Fantastic. So what we call Zionism, I think we're going to start with this. What we call Zionism today refers to a modern movement, okay? However, it is a modern movement which is based in an ancient movement. So we're going to look at some of those roots today, the ancient roots, and then we're going to get into the earliest rumblings of Zionism in the 19th century, of modern Zionism in the 19th century. Now, as you also know, when I do this, whenever I teach these lunch and learn classes, this is I consider this Torah. Now, you might think that why is learning about a modern contemporary movement Torah? And the answer is, well, it's Jewish, and everything Jewish in my book is Torah. So we will today, in fact, be quoting some biblical stuff. So it's worth saying the bracha for Torah study if you've not already recited it today. I don't have it up on screen, but it's the one that ends with La'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise you, God, who commands us to engage with words of Torah. Okay, so please recite with me, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And with that, I want to say that Zionism, if you could close the door, that'd be great. Zionism, like the other contemporary movements of Judaism, is an essential part of the Jewish landscape beginning in the 19th century. We got a bunch of kids going by there. They're all waving at the rabbi. So it's one of the pleasures of my job is that I get to see them come through from time to time, and they say, "There's the rabbi." So Zionism, like the movements of conservative and reform and orthodoxy, it's a little different, but it is somehow related. And there are certainly scholars of contemporary Judaism who consider Zionism to be a movement alongside those. And in fact, it develops alongside and to some extent as a part of those. It's worth noting, by the way, that orthodoxy, which is a much more sort of complicated movement because there are many types of orthodoxies. Orthodoxy itself is, of course, a movement that is a response to modernity, just like reform and conservative are as well. So please be aware that when I'm talking about Zionism, I'm talking about a contemporary movement that some consider a contemporary offshoot of Judaism, not an offshoot, but a part of contemporary Judaism that is like the modern movements that we have. So along those lines, as some of you know, I always start with a timeline because the timeline reminds us where we've been and where we're going. So here is the basic timeline of Jewish history that anybody who's learned with me before has seen many times already. But it's worth noting, of course, we're here at the far right, not theologically or politically, of course, just we're at the end of the timeline, all right, and still moving forward there to the right. And this is the last 3,000 years of Jewish history. And again, Zionism, the way that we think of it today, arrives back in the middle of the 19th century over here. You can actually, it's fortunate we have the first Aliyah. It's hard to see over there. Can I do that? Oh yeah, it's a little bigger. See over here.
Charts in here?
I do not. I can get you one later if you want. Okay. I always keep extras on hand. I didn't bring them with me. But yes, but the Aliyah begins in earnest in actually the 1860s and then into the 1880s. But of course, there are Jews living in Israel throughout all this time. There is one town in the north of Galilee that has had continuous Jewish Jews living there. It's called Pki'in. I think there are no more Jews there today, but that's since the 20th century, things became a little more complicated. But in any case, but religious Zionism, shall we say, which some might refer to as Messianism, really has its origins back in here around the time of the Second Temple period. Remember, the Second Temple is destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, and then once the Bar Kokhba rebellion is crushed about 60 years later, the idea of Zionism becomes more important in Jewish life. That is to say, the Jews are no longer allowed to live in Jerusalem or within sight of Jerusalem. They are wandering off at this point to other places. There's already a well-established Iraqi community. There are Egyptian Jews, but the Jews are moving more into Europe. They're moving into Italy and then north from there. And throughout this period, Messianism is very much connected to this idea of yearning for what we had back here, which is to say, Jewish centrality in the land of Israel. The temple is standing in Jerusalem. The sacrifices are being performed in the temple. Since this destruction in the year 70, of course, none of that is happening. And so throughout all of these nearly 2,000 years, the Jews are living all over the world. Judaism has become a portable tradition. It has become what we do here at Beth Shalom, which is prayer out of prayer books in synagogues, and that's a very different existence from what they had back here. So Zionism, or this religious Zionism, which you might call Messianism, is this yearning for this time when the temple is standing, when the sacrifices are standing, when we can do what the Torah tells us to do, which is to offer sacrifices, and that there's this great myth arises in rabbinic literature later in this rabbinic period, to say that someday we're going to return. And we the Jews, as we are traveling all over the world, we are, and carrying our texts with us, we are carrying with us also this idea, this yearning for return. Okay, so that is sort of historical Zionism, which is related to the idea of Mashiach. What does the word Mashiach literally mean? Yes, I know it translates as Messiah. That's just English in Hebrew, or Hebrew in English. What does Mashiach mean? Anyone know?
Sorry.
Anointed. Anointed. It is someone who's had oil poured over his head, because in the ancient world, that's how you knew who the king was, because the judge, Shmuel, for example, pours oil over the head of King Shaul, the first king, and then does he anoint David as well? Somebody anoints David as well. But in any case, they are anointed, and the Mashiach ideology, this sort of myth of Mashiach, springs up around, we're going to reestablish the Davidic throne. Remember, King David is king all the way back in here. He's not even actually on here. He's like around 1000 BCE, 3,000 years ago. So again, there's this yearning for this Davidic throne, the good old days. The good old days. And of course, this yearning for when the temple's still standing. And of course, once it's destroyed in the year 70, all that goes away. So again, throughout these nearly 2,000 years, the only form of yearning for Zion is that kind of, we want to go back to Israel, which is our land, the land we came from. It's the land of the Torah, it's the land where the Hebrew language originated. It's the land that God gave us, and it's religious. And just as an example, you find this, by the way, not only in rabbinic literature, but also in the Torah. There are verses there's a verse in Numbers. This is Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. That it sort of has an apocalyptic message about it. But darach kochav miYaakov, a star rises from Jacob, a scepter comes forth from Israel. It smashes the brow of Moab, the foundation of all children of Seth. It's one of the few places where Seth is mentioned after the first couple of chapters of Bereshit. Was that? Yeah, right. Seth is, of course, the son of the third son of Adam and Eve, and the one whom all humanity must be descended, right? And therefore, of course, Jews. Jeremiah has a verse, Hine yamim ba'im neum Adonai v'akimoti leDavid tzemach tzadik, etc. See, a time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up a true branch of David's line. He shall reign as king and shall prosper, and he shall do what is just and right in the land. Again, I'm just giving you some. There are plenty of other biblical texts we refer to. Some of the texts we'll look at Somebody's making noise. Okay. We'll see in the passages that we're going to read. But in any case, so messianism is this deep-rooted religious idea of returning to our land, return to the good old days. Now, what happens when we get to the to over here in the 19th century? Well, really the 18th century in fact, I could probably put down the timeline now because I think we more or less got it because we're going to move forward basically. So beginning more or less with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, so the end of the 18th century, the idea of nationalism emerges. And nationalism is this idea that we as a culture are a nation. I'm not talking about the Jews specifically. I'm talking about the French, okay, or the Germans, and that European cultures start to see themselves as belonging to a nation. I'm not just a speaker of the German language or a dialect of German who lives under the authority of a king who identifies as German, but rather all German peoples share something, and that something is that we are a nation. Okay, so it's and the idea of a nation is that it's sort of it takes up the same space as Germany. Like the German nation are the people that live within Germany. Now, borders are always tricky and like how you decide where the borders are. As we all know, borders in Europe changed and all over the world have changed throughout history, right? You know, where does Germany end and France begin? Well, that's a question that we're going to ask. Where does Poland begin? Sometimes Poland isn't even there at all on the map. You know, these things go back and forth. But all Poles, of course, are clearly Polish and part of the Polish nation. And that's the idea that's emerging in the 19th century. Now, what makes Zionism different? Now, remember the Jews who are gaining emancipation at this time. Okay, the French Republic is the first to give citizenship to the Jews, and to make the Jews effectively French. Now, it's a slow process. You don't overnight become French, but the French people don't necessarily immediately recognize the Jews as French, right? Or the Germans recognize the Jews as German, but they are beginning to speak the language of the people around them. Some of them are going to universities in the early 19th century. The Reform movement is going to emerge at this time in the early 19th century because there are these now university-educated German Jews who want to be Germans on the street and Jews in the home. It's really hot in here, is it me? I'm taking off my sweater. Sorry, stripping on camera here. Sorry about this. So forgive me. So in any case, so suddenly Jews are gaining secular knowledge, and they want to be thought of as Germans or French, and part of the French Republic or part of Germany, and so they're looking for a change to their religious engagement that reflects the fact that they are Germans as well as Jewish, or Germans of the Mosaic persuasion or something like that. And one of the things that they do, by the way, is they advocate for prayer in German. Right. And they advocate for, one of the things that actually does happen is they start to eliminate references to Israel and Zion in Jewish liturgy, because that says, well, if we want to go back to Israel, that means we're not German. Right, but we want to be German. Germany is the center of civilization. Germany is the center of philosophy. So these Jews are starting to, some of these Jews are starting to sort of like Germanize their religion. For some, that goes a little too far, and hence there are other movements as well. But Zionism emerges as a part of this time, because just as some Jews are thinking to themselves, well, we're German, some are also thinking, well, we are a Jewish nation. Even as we're becoming German citizens, even as we're gaining German citizenship or French citizenship, we also belong to another nation. And that nation is the nation of Yisrael, is the nation of the Jews. Okay, so Jewish nationalism emerges alongside European nationalism at this time. Okay, and the earliest examples of this are actually people who are thinking in two worlds. They're thinking in the Jewish world, as well as now they're thinking about European nationalism. So for example, the very first, and by the way, I'm following the pattern of Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, who wrote this book called The Zionist Idea, which is this. I'm not sure what year this is published, but it's probably the 1960s. This is a book that includes the writings of all the early Zionist writers. And the first one that he mentions is Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, who is born in Sarajevo. He's actually from a Sephardic family. They're actually in former Yugoslavia. There are plenty of Sephardim who came from elsewhere, and they came from Spain or they came from North Africa. And so Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai is the son of a rabbi. He's actually born in Sarajevo. His father is the rabbi of the Sarajevo community. And in 1825, so he's born in 1798, so he's about 27 years old. He becomes the rabbi in a suburb of Belgrade called the Jews called Zemlin, although today it's called Zemun. You can find that on a map. Around Belgrade, capital of Serbia. And he first publishes a book about the creation of Jewish colonies in Israel in 1834. That's very early. Okay, remember that Herzl in the First Zionist Congress, that doesn't happen until 1897. Okay, so a long way before that. And he says at this time, he's starting to think that maybe we need to divert some of our communal resources to move to Israel and start building this Jewish home. Now, Zionism, of course, remember, is different from German nationalism or French nationalism because they're not in their country. They're in a different place. So already there's this problem of what do we do if we're living here subject to these people that, by the way, don't really like us? And here we are, a nation. We have two paths. Either we can be more like them, or we can move somewhere else and establish our nation there, our state that is a reflection of our nation. Okay, nationalism basically says that the state and the nation are the same thing. Okay, or they live in the same space. Okay, so Alkali writes many things, but he's particularly moved by in 1840 in Damascus. Remember, that's the capital of Syria. Damascus, there's a blood libel. There's a Capuchin friar who is murdered, and the local Jewish community. There is a Jewish community in Damascus, healthy Jewish community in Damascus, as in other Syrian cities, in 1840, and the Jews are blamed for the murder of this Catholic priest. And riots ensue and bad things happen, and this is very shocking to the Jews of Europe because they've gained emancipation. They're thinking we're now people of the world, and look now, there's this like typical anti-Semitic stuff is still going on. Boy, isn't that striking? So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I just want to show you just a brief bit about what Alkali writes. This is from his something he wrote called The Third Redemption in 1843. It's from another book, the name of which I don't have in front of me. But in 1843, he says the following, and he starts by quoting. I need a volunteer to just read a little at the beginning there. It is written. Okay, Mindy, thank you.
It is written in the Bible, return, O Lord, unto the tens and thousands of the families of Israel. And this verse, the rabbis commented in Talmud as follows. It proves that the divine presence can be felt only if there are at least 2 thousands and 2 tens of thousands of Israelites together. Yet we pray every day that our eyes behold thy return in mercy unto Zion. Upon whom should the divine presence rest? On sticks and stones? Therefore, as the first step in the redemption of our souls, we must cause at least 22,000 to return to the Holy. This is the necessary preparation for a descent of the divine presence among us afterward. He will grant us in all Israel further signs of his favor.
Okay, good. By the way, that text that he starts with, "Return, O Lord," and actually it's a bad translation. It should say, "Return, O Lord, the tens and thousands of the families of Israel," not unto. That doesn't make sense. And by the way, we say this, or at least we mumble it, every time we put the Torah away. Uvnu choyomar shuva Adonai rivavot alfei Yisrael. Okay, again, we mumble that part. The Yuvnu Yomar we all say out loud, usually right before we put the Torah away. But return, O Lord, tens and thousands of the families of Israel. And Rabbi Alkali reads this, that means that at least before the Mashiach is going to come, we need at least 22,000 people to move to Israel. Now, what's he doing, by the way? Just by saying that, he's saying, we're not waiting for God. The Messianic idea says there's going to be a Redeemer who's going to take us all back to Israel, right? Remember, he's very much steeped in traditional Jewish thought. He's a rabbi. He's an Orthodox rabbi. It's okay to call him Orthodox in 1843. And he believes in the Messianic redemption, but he's also saying, you know what? Actually, we might need to do this ourselves. And jump down, and I need another volunteer to read the next couple paragraphs down where it says, in the first conquest. Can somebody read that? Volunteer. You want me to do it? Or Mindy, you want to keep going? Keep going, Mindy.
In the first conquest under Joshua, the Almighty brought the children of Israel into a land that was prepared. Its houses were then full of useful things. Its wells were given water, and its vineyards and olive groves were laden with fruit. This new redemption will, alas, because of our sins, be different.
Okay, so remember this, when he says this new redemption, he's talking about the redemption that I'm talking about now, about you guys going back to, about you, the Jews, going back to Israel. Yeah.
Our land is waste and desolate. We shall have to build houses, dig wells, and plant vines and olive trees. We are therefore commanded not to attempt to go at once and altogether to the Holy Land. In the first place, it is necessary for many Jews to remain for a time in the lands of dispersion, so that they can help the first settlers into Palestine, who will undoubtedly come from among the poor. Secondly, the Lord desires that we be redeemed and dignity, not therefore migrate in a mass, for we should then have to live like Bedouins, scattered in tents all over the fields of the Holy Land. Redemption must come slowly. The land must, by degrees, be built up and prepared. Okay, so he's saying we're going to have to go a few folks at a time to build this. I'm actually, you know what? I want to get to a lot more more stuff. You can of course keep these copies. If anybody online, by the way, wants a copy, let me know and I'll put one out for the desk. Put one out of the desk for you so you can see it. We're going to move on but that's a taste of Alkali. Again, he's really at least Hertzberg says he's the first Zionist writer to say this. You know what? It's time for us to start thinking about moving there. Okay. By the way, Rabbi Alkali, he lives most of his life, like I said, in Eastern Europe. He does end up in Jerusalem. Toward the end of his life, he actually dies there, and to this day you can see his grave on the Mount of Olives. So he did start a few small societies to sort of promote this idea in Europe, including one that had some traction in London, but it was not so successful. He's kind of a footnote in history. Very few people have heard of it. Okay, but the next guy, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, is a little bit more resonant, shall we say, more successful in his message. And he's born in what is today Poland. He's born in what's called Posen, Germany. Today it's Poznań, which is Western Poland. And that time it's area that is sort of on the border with Germany and goes back and forth between Poland and Germany. Both of these characters, interestingly enough, come from lands where the borders are shifting, and so they have this sense of you might say that their nationalism is rooted in their desire to feel connected to a people in a place that is politically fraught because of the different cultures and nations in their midst. So Rabbi Kalischer, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, of course, he's not born a rabbi. No rabbi is born a rabbi, but he's from Posen, and he is something of a traditionalist in the early 19th century during the rise of Reform, advocating for traditional worship and so forth. He writes a letter to the Rothschild family's head in Berlin in 1836. Okay, so he's saying the following. The beginning of the redemption will come. You don't have this. The beginning of the redemption will come through natural causes, by human effort, and by the will of the governments to gather the scattered of Israel into the Holy Land. So he's starting to think, as are some others, that it is time for us to leave Europe. Because the Jews are not living in a great situation in much of Europe, particularly in the East. He becomes involved in 1860 in a German society to foster Jewish settlement in Israel, and he publishes his best-known work, Drishat Zion, which we have here on our screen, in 1862. We'll read a little bit of this.
This is just an excerpt. He does go on to help. He's instrumental in helping a group to buy some land in Jaffa in 1866. That is a land that would now be part of the greater Tel Aviv Jaffa municipality. And he helped found an agricultural school in Jaffa in 1870. So he actually has a little bit more success in trying to get some things going in the land of Israel. So I need a volunteer to read the beginning of Rabbi Kalisher's work here. Okay, Audrey, thank you. The redemption of Israel.
The redemption of Israel, for which we long, is not to be imagined as a sudden miracle. The Almighty, blessed be his name, will not suddenly descend from on high and command his people to go forth. He will not send the Messiah from heaven in a twinkling of an eye to sound the great trumpet for the scattered of Israel to gather them into Jerusalem. He will not surround the holy city with a wall of fire or cause the holy temple to descend from the heavens. The bliss and the miracles that were promised by his servants, the prophets, will certainly come to pass. Everything will be fulfilled, but we will not run in terror and flight, for the redemption of Israel will come by slow degrees, and the ray of deliverance will shine forth gradually.
Okay, so again, a little bit more forceful, I would say, than Rabbi Alkali. He says that the Messiah is not coming, or at least not soon enough, right? Rather, we're going to have to do some more. Keep reading a little.
My dear reader, cast aside the conventional view that the Messiah will suddenly sound a blast on the great trumpet and cause all the inhabitants of the earth to tremble. On the contrary, the redemption will begin by awakening support among the philanthropists and by gaining the consent of the nations to the gathering of some of the scattered of Israel into the Holy Land.
Okay, so how are we going to make this happen? Rich people. We got to find people with money, right? So actually, the good news here is that he's thinking a little practically. You can't just actually, I think Rabbi Alkali mentions this a little bit. There's just, we can't just all move en masse, right? You got to build infrastructure. There's not much there. But there is a need for people with money to be able to promote this idea, which will someday be called Zionism. I don't think he uses this term, but to send people to Israel. The classic joke about how many Zionists it take to screw in a light bulb? No. This actually, it's a joke, but it tells a lot about what we're reading. There's one, so it's a whole lot. I don't know, 127 Zionists. There's one to convince another to raise money from a third, to send a fourth to Israel to build the light bulb factory on the kibbutz, and all the kibbutznikim to argue about who gets what hours they get to work at the light bulb factory, produce the light bulb factory, and then one guy to screw it in. So it's a whole lot of Zionists to screw in a light bulb. So the idea though is that from the outset, Zionism has acknowledged that, well, there are some practical matters here. I'm reading, by the way, before we get to Hess, we'll read a little bit more of Kalisher, but I just started reading the newest book by Yuval Noah Harari, which some of you know I really love. He's an Israeli scholar. His best known book is Sapiens. He's a historian who talks about sort of the arc of humanity and technology and how technology has changed our lives for the better and for the worse. And he talks about at the beginning of Nexus that the first technology is story. The first technology is story, because story, you can motivate people more than just than just looking at things and trying to figure out what's going on. Very different from academia and bureaucracy and lists. He talks about those things as well. But story is a way that you motivate people, right? So from the outset, though, Kalisher has an eye to the practical. We can't just pick up and move. We gotta build, and it's gonna be slow. Okay. Let's flip over the next page 113. Can again, thinking practically, just read a little bit more. Audrey, why don't you were doing so well. Just say there are many, where it says the holiness to labor the land. There are many.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There are many who will refuse to support the poor of the Holy Land by saying, why should we support poor people, support people who choose idleness, who are lazy and not interested in working, and who prefer to depend upon the Jews of the diaspora to support them.
Remember, what he's thinking is that the people who are going to be who are easiest to pick up and move are the ones who don't have very much, right? If I have a successful business, I'm not picking up from Berlin and moving to Israel where there's nothing, right? And by the way, this has been true more or less throughout Israel's history. I'll never forget. By the way, I'm sorry, I got a lot of stories. One of my most Zionist experiences ever was when I was living in Israel in 1999 with and I was on the Wujas Institute, and we had a couple of weeks of a volunteer period, and I worked on at kibbutz Kinneret, which is one of the oldest kibbutzim. It's up the very bottom of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, and I worked for a couple of days with the beekeeper, whose name was Noga Ben Zion, which is, by the way, if you know some Hebrew, that's like one of the most Zionist names ever. So Noga Ben Zion, and she was thrilled. She had a volunteer who spoke Hebrew, so we chatted in Hebrew the whole time. And she told me about it was very important for her. She told me, why did my parents come to Israel in the 30s or whatever, because of Zionism. And what she was saying was they didn't come because they were poor and they had nothing else. They were ideologues. They came because they were motivated by the idea that the Jews needed to live in their own land, which is not why most people came to Israel. Most people, the majority, came to Israel because they had no better option wherever they were. Okay, and Kailasher acknowledged that he sees that even back in 1862. Is that right? Okay, please go on and read a little more.
To be sure, this is an argument put forth by Satan. For the people of Palestine are students of the Torah, unaccustomed from the time of their youth to physical labor. Most of them came from distant shores, risking their very lives for the privilege of living in the Holy Land. In this country, which is strange to them, how could they go about finding a business or an occupation when they
skip this? Go down to yet in order.
Yet, in order to silence this argument once and for all, I would suggest that an organization be established to encourage settlement in the Holy Land for the purpose of purchasing and cultivating farms and vineyards. Such a program would appear as a ray of deliverance to those now living in the land in poverty and famine. The pittance that is gathered from the entire Jewish world for their support is not enough to satisfy their hunger. Indeed, in Jerusalem, the city which should be a source of blessing and well-being, many pious and saintly people are fainting of hunger in the streets.
Okay, it was not an easy life in the land of Palestine at this time. Keep going.
The situation would be different if we were inspired by the fervor of working the land with our own hands. Surely God would bless our labor, and there would be no need to import grain from Egypt and other neighboring countries, for our harvest would prosper greatly. Once the Jews in the Holy Land began to eat of their own produce, the financial aid of the diaspora would support.
Okay, again, also he's presupposing the reality of the early Zionist project, and to some extent today, that Israel will have to develop its own agricultural and ultimately its own industry, and the people of the diaspora are going to have to send money. And guess what? We still do. Right. Okay. So that's we could read more, but that's he does give a little paragraph of that at the end about nationalism. We should be ashamed of ourselves. All the other peoples have striven only for the sake of their own national honor. How much more should we, the Jews, exert ourselves? For our duty is to labor not only for the glory of our ancestors, but for the glory of God who chose Zion. So he's still, to some extent, he mentions God. He's still, to some extent, riffing on this sort of messianic idea of rebuilding Israel for the purposes of what in the rabbinic mind was the Mashiach's role. It's still a holy endeavor. It's still religious, if you will, but also a little bit more of an eye to the practical. Okay, let's move on, because Hess is the most interesting and the most relevant here author that we're going to encounter. Hess, by the way, so he writes in 1862 this piece that we're going to read, Rome and Jerusalem, and it's kind of a what you might call, I guess, a monograph. It's a short book. Moses Hess is born in 1812 in Bonn, Germany, which remember that this problem about borders is actually part of the French Republic at that time when he's born. Of course, Bonn returns to Germany at some point, and it's historically German. But he is raised. He's I guess at age 9, his parents moved somewhere else, and he's raised by his grandfather, who is, guess what, a rabbi. And so he's well steeped in Judaism and knowledge of Jewish text, but he kind of leaves that. And he studies philosophy. And ultimately, by the way, he publishes his first book in 1837. So, I mean, he's a bright guy. It's called, by the way, this is great, The Holy History of Mankind by a Young Spinozist. He was a fan of Spinoza. Spinoza, of course, having been the Jewish philosopher best known for having been excommunicated by the Jews of Amsterdam. But he also travels in socialist circles in Germany and in Paris, and he becomes friends with, of all people, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So to the two of them, the three of them are buddy. Marx is the editor of this newspaper that he writes for, and it's a sort of a radical newspaper I think published in either Cologne or in Bonn. So he himself, Hess, is a socialist, and he actually ultimately breaks with Marx because when Marx publishes the Communist Manifesto, Hess disagrees with that tremendously. But he's committed to socialism, what he refers to as scientific socialism. He moves to Paris in 1853 and has a kind of a Jewish awakening where he remembers the Judaism of his youth. He's been sort of committed to the socialist project for a number of years. And he at some point, at this point in the 1860s, he returns to Judaism. Curiously, by the way, along the way, he marries a French prostitute who is a Catholic woman, and his family disowned him for that reason. But it is curious that this man, whose wife is a French Catholic prostitute, is one of the earliest relevant writers about Zionism. His work is kind of lost to the for some time. Herzl rediscovers it, by the way, when after he's become Theodor Herzl and after he's convened the first Zionist convention and so forth. And in fact, and he says, "Boy, if I had known about this guy Hess, I would have started on this project much earlier," because he's very inspired by Hess's work. Hess's work, when I read this for the first time a few days ago, this kind of blew my mind, because some of the things that he says are absolutely, you'll see, resonate in a way in this very moment, in a way that many of us, I'm sure you'll see. Okay, I want to let's take a look at what Hess writes. Who would like to, any other volunteer to read? We're starting, sorry, where it says Rome and Jerusalem, My Way of Return. Okay, that's on page, what page is that? 119. Thank you. You volunteer already? You volunteer to read? Got it? Mm-hmm. After 20 years.
After 20 years of surrender, I have returned to my people. Once again, I'm sharing in its festivals of joy and great sorrow, in its hope and memory. I'm taking part in the spiritual and intellectual struggles of our day, both within the house of Israel and between our people and the Gentile world. The Jews have lived and labored among the nations for almost 2,000 years, but nonetheless, they cannot become rooted organically within.
Okay, so he's saying that as I'm remembering the Judaism of my youth and recalling the stories that I've heard, I realize, and I'm looking at my people, I'm seeing we're still not French. We're still not German. We're Jewish. Please, Arita, keep going.
Sentimental Gagarine I expressed beyond the fall is a lie once again. It is the thought of my nationality, which is inseparably connected with my ancestral heritage, with the Holy Land and the eternal city, the birthplace of the allegiance to the divine unity of life and of the hope for the ultimate brotherhood of all men. For years, When half-strangled emotion had been stirring in my breast and clamoring for expression. But I had not the strength to swerve from my own path, which seemed so far from the road of Judaism, to a new one which I can envision only vaguely in the hazy distance.
Yeah, read a little more. He's going to talk about this incident in Damascus.
20 years ago, when the news came to Europe from Damascus of an absurd accusation against the Jews, a feeling of agony, as bitter as it was justified, was evoked in the hearts of all Jews. Once again, we were face to face with the ignorance and credulity of the mobs of Asia and Europe, which are as ready today as they have been for the past 2,000 years to believe any calumny directed against them.
Okay, pause right there. What's he saying? He's saying that this incident of the blood libel in Damascus in 1840 has reminded me that all my non-Jewish neighbors, they believe this. They believe that the Jews killed this guy to take his blood to make matzah. That's the classic European medieval blood libel that Jews were subject to for hundreds of years. And here we are in 1840. We've gained a citizenship. We are French citizens. We are German citizens. And even so, this we're now created these big, giant, beautiful Reformed temples where we can pray in the vernacular. And some of us have even distanced ourselves from the idea of return to Israel. And yet it doesn't matter, because there are people, there are anti-Semites. He doesn't use the word, but there are people who will still believe any awful thing you say about the Jews, because it's baked into who they are as Europeans. Okay. So he's saying he's actually sort of he's struck by this as being just sort of like a blow of reality to remind him that anti-Semitism isn't going away, despite the fact that we have gained that we are now citizens of the state in Europe. Okay, flip over to the next page. Another volunteer to read. Yeah, top of 120, the pure human nature. And by the way, pure human nature, it says in quotes, he's actually quoting I believe it's his publisher who has rejected publication of this work that he's writing about. Go ahead.
The pure human nature of the Germans is in reality the nature of the pure German race, which can rise to the concept of humanity in theory only. But in practice, it has not yet transcended its innate racial sympathies and antipathies. German antagonism to our Jewish national aspirations has two sources, reflecting the dual nature of man, the spiritual and natural aspects, the theoretical and practical sides, which are nowhere so sharply defined and opposed to one another as among the Germans.
Okay, so there's what he's talking about is this sort of deep-seated German anti-Semitism. Now remember, this is 1862, right? We know what's going to happen less than a century later, right? But the roots are all there, right? It's not going away. Please go on a little more.
National aspirations as a whole are contrary to the theoretical internationalism of the Germans. However, in addition to this, Germans oppose Jewish national aspirations because of racial antipathy, which even the noblest spirits have not yet overcome. Okay,
so the Germans have imagined themselves as internationalists. We're beyond this whole business of like different cultures. We're people of the world, some of them are saying, right? And yet, what do they object to? Jewish nationalism. Go on.
The same German whose pure human nature revolted against publishing a book advocating the revival of the Jewish nationality, and no objection to publishing books against Jews and Judaism, though the purpose of such works is basically opposed to pure human nature.
Okay, so what he's talking about is that his publisher, this publisher that I guess he'd worked with and published other things with, rejected this work which talks about Jewish nationalism, and by the way, has also published things which are kind of blatantly anti-Semitic. Go on.
This contradiction can be explained only on the basis of inborn racial antagonism. But the Germans, it seems, it seems, has no clear awareness of his racial prejudices. He makes no distinction between his egotistic and his spiritual endeavors, and regards both as striving towards values which are not merely Teutonic, but really humanistic. He does not know that he follows the latter only in theory, while in practice he clings to his egotistic ideas.
Right. So pure human nature sounds like, again, maybe it must have been something the publisher said, or maybe this is an idea that's in the sort of like the German intellectual ferment of the time, that the Germans are humanists, right? And yet will not allow this idea of Jewish nationalism. He does, of course, when he uses the word race. That's sort of unique to the time. They're talking about race as like there's the German race and the French race and the Jewish race, I guess. So just be aware that we don't use the word the same way, but keep going, please.
Progressive German Jews also seem to think that they have sufficient reason for recoiling from any Jewish national expression. My dear old friend Berthold Auerbach is just as disappointed with me as my former publisher is, though not on the grounds of pure human nature. He complains bitterly about my attitude and finally exclaims, "Who appointed you as the prince and judge over us?"
Okay, again, so he's obviously Hess is talking about this idea of Jewish nationalism enough to upset his friends, basically, and Auerbach himself, of course, is Jewish. Some German Jews are thinking, well, we want to be like the Germans. We're thinking like the Germans who have this pure human nature. Again, he didn't use that, but still, not all German Jews are cool with the idea of let's think about moving to Israel. All right, keep going.
Because of the hatred that surrounds him on all sides, the German Jew is determined to cast off all signs of his Jewishness and to deny his race.
Ouch, stop there for a minute. Wow. So this just like blows my mind. What's going on? Are the German Jews, have they begun this process of reform because they want to be like Germans, or is it that they're ashamed of their Jewishness? Now, some of us know, okay, when I was a kid, so I grew up in the conservative movement, okay, and you know, I would say that what we did at my conservative synagogue in Western Massachusetts was a lot like what happens at Beth Shalom on a Shabbat morning. Okay, similar idea, egalitarian, of course, some singing along, you know, and when we went to, and of course, no instruments, when we went to a Reformed congregation in the 70s and 80s, like it felt a lot like church. There were often organs, you know, very formal. The rabbi would be wearing a robe, you know, it's very formality that I didn't see in synagogue growing up and seemed to me very, well, to use the elegant French term, goyish, right? It's just like not Jewish. And he's seeing this, of course, at the same time, because one of the goals of reform, in addition to, I mentioned, taking out references to Israel and Zion in liturgy, they also wanted their worship to have decorum. That people should be quiet and only sing when they're reading out of the hymnal, chanting out of the hymnal, and they're very formal in the vernacular, in German. Very sort of, it looked alien to people coming from a traditional Jewish background. Now remember, Hess has left this. He hasn't been involved for 30 years in Jewish life, but he remembers the Judaism of his childhood, and he's saying what these reformers are doing, these progressive German Jews, is they're distancing themselves from their very Jewishness. Okay, okay. Please read just a little more. Yeah, read the rest of this. Keep going.
No reform of the Jewish religion, however extreme, is radical enough for the educated German Jews. But even an act of conversion cannot relieve the Jew of the enormous pressure of German anti-Semitism. Conversion
to Christianity, which, by the way, was in this time a way of getting ahead in life. Okay, even though you were recognized as a German citizen. And even if you had secular education and spoke German flawlessly and dressed like Germans instead of like, a Jew, you still couldn't get past the fact that people would look at you and see a Jew, right? And so that's very much a part of this. There's a sort of a well-known story about this. It's a little later, but still, this is a phenomenon that goes on for the rest of the 19th century into the 20th. Most famously, Franz Rosenzweig, who is one of the greatest contemporary philosophers of Judaism, of Jewish life. He lives in Germany. He's a secular Jew, pretty much. But he's decided he's going to convert. and he decides, I'm going to give Judaism one last chance. And he goes to a synagogue at Kol Nidre, sort of famous story, Kol Nidre, and he's so inspired by the services that he decides, how could I possibly leave this? He hadn't given it a fair shot. How could I possibly leave this beautiful, rich tradition? Again, this is much later, but that phenomenon is in play. People are converting away from Judaism because it will give them a chance to be accepted. There are plenty of examples. Perhaps one that you who's the composer that converts Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn. Thank you. So Felix Mendelssohn's grandfather is Moses Mendelssohn, who is largely considered the first modern Jew, the first emancipated Jew. Who studies philosophy, and he goes in and out of the salons of Berlin in the middle of the 18th century. So he's a century before this. His grandson converts to Christianity because he wants to succeed as a actually, I can't remember if it's Mendelssohn or his father. I think it's actually his father that converts the family. Anyway, but it doesn't matter. It was a phenomenon. Moses Mendelssohn's son converts to Christianity because he doesn't feel like he can be fully accepted as a Jew. Sorry, go ahead. Read a little more if you will.
The Germans hate the religion of the Jews less than they hate their race. They hate the peculiar faith of the Jews less than their peculiar noses. Reform, conversion, education, and emancipation. None of these open the gates of society to the German Jew, hence his desire to deny his racial origin.
Okay. Basically, that's probably enough of that. But what he's saying is that it doesn't matter what you do, you're still going to be, even if you convert, you're still going to be seen as a Jew. He also he goes out of his way, Hess does, to criticize the Reform movement because he says they're just aiding and abetting. You know, by creating these Reform synagogues where they're praying in the vernacular and taking out references to Zion and Israel and praying like their Christian neighbors do, they're not helping the situation. That ultimately that will not solve the Jewish problem, if you will. Okay, let's skip down. Another volunteer to read The Really Dishonorable Jew at the bottom of that page where we were. How are we doing on time? Oh boy, we are just. There's so much to read. Let's read a little more. Yeah, The Really Dishonorable Jew. Another volunteer. Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
The really dishonorable Jew is not the old time, pious one, who would rather have his tongue cut out than utter a word in denial of his nationality. But the modern kind, who, like the German outcasts in foreign countries, is ashamed of his nationality because the hand of faith is pressing heavily upon his pieces. The beautiful phrases about humanity and enlightenment he uses so freely to focus treason, his fear of being identified with his unfortunate brethren will ultimately not protect him from the judgment of public opinion. The modern Jews hide in vain behind their geographical and philosophical alibis. You may mask yourself 1,000 times over. You may change your name, religion, and character. You may travel through the world incognito, so that people may not recognize the Jew in you. Yet every insult to the Jewish name will strike you even more than the honest man who admits his Jewish loyalties and fights for the honor of the
So doesn't matter what you do, says Hess, they will always see you as the Jew and not the German. And if you try to fight against that, you're just going to make it worse. I'm going to just to move it along. I'm reading at the top of page 123. In those countries which form the dividing line between the Occident and the Orient, that's obviously West and East, namely Russia, Poland, Prussia, Austria, and Turkey, there live millions of our brethren who pray fervently every day to the God of their fathers for the restoration of the Jewish kingdom. Okay, unlike, by the way, the Reform Jews who've taken those references out of their Siddur, their prayer book. These Jews have preserved the living kernel of Judaism, the sense of Jewish nationality, more faithfully than our Occidental brethren. Skipping down, only a national renaissance can endow the religious genius of the Jews like the legendary giant when he touches Mother Earth with new strength and raise its soul once again to the level of prophetic inspiration. The enlighteners, and here he's again talking about the reformers, have attempted to open the Jewish scene to the light of modern culture by piercing the hard shell with which rabbinism had armored Judaism. None of them, not even the great Mendelssohn, could succeed in doing this without inevitably destroying the innermost essence of Judaism, its historical national religion, and thus doing a sacred life to death. Reform, he is saying, and again, he's complaining bitterly about this, and I'm not casting aspersions of the reform movement. Just make sure that's clear. This is Hess, and I have a great love for my reform friends and neighbors and colleagues. But he sees this, what they have done, as having eviscerated Jewish life. And that ultimately, of course, what he's going to turn to is the need for reestablishing Israel. Let me see if I can find a passage that captures that, because we only have a few minutes left. And I told you I would. Let's skip over to page 125. The bottom. There are two epochs that mark the development of Jewish law. The first after the liberation from Egypt, the second after the return from Babylonia, and the third is yet to come with redemption from the third exile. So he's actually casting Judaism in Europe in the middle 19th century as being the end, what will be a new sort of paradigm for Jewish life. This is the end of this epoch of dispersion, and now is the time for this redemption to come. We are going home. Okay, skip over to 126 at the bottom. 126 at the bottom. Our people must once again steep itself in its history, which has been grossly neglected by our rationalists. Again, that's a dig at progressive reform enlightened Jews in Germany, neglected by our rationalists, and rekindle in the hearts of our younger generation that spirit which was the ultimate source of wisdom and inspiration for both our prophets and our rabbis. If we begin once again to draw our inspiration from the ultimate sources of Judaism, our doctors of the law will regain among us the authority which they justly forfeited from the moment when, prompted by motives other than patriotism, they estranged themselves from Judaism and attempted to reform Jewish law. We will then again become participators in the Holy Spirit, which alone has the right to develop Jewish law and refashion it according to the needs of the people. And then, when the third exile will finally have come to an end, the restoration of the Jewish state will find us ready for it in the right spirit. Okay, I'm going to have to stop reading there. There's a whole lot more to read. I suggest you take this, and this is a little light reading before bed. Just kidding. But Hess's words are actually quite powerful, and I think he makes a fantastic case for the fact that the Jews will always be seen as Jews, not recognized as Germans. Now, I would say things are a little different in America today. Nonetheless, and here this is obviously my opinion, and you'll take it or leave it. But I would say that some of the challenges that we have faced now, again, we're living in a world in which Israel is a reality. 76 years of the state of Israel. Did you want to before I get ahead?
I don't want to. There's something in here that I don't think should be missed.
Okay.
On that sentence.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
And we will again become participants in the Holy Spirit, which allows us the right to develop Jewish law and refashion it according to the needs of the people.
Very interesting.
Conservatively.
Yeah, well, it is certainly, actually, I think that will be very helpful when we read Achad Ha'am, when we get to later sessions. Okay. Achad Ha'am is the who comes up with this idea of what he calls the Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual set, that Israel is the spiritual center of the Jewish people. But yes, he doesn't like what the reformers have done, but he thinks there's another path. And that's what he's saying. Okay, very good. Look, I think we have to acknowledge, particularly, in the current situation in which we found ourselves, that there are a lot of people who feel like the Jews should not have a homeland in the state of Israel. And what Hess says, and what these authors, all these Zionist authors, will ultimately say is, yes, the state of Israel is necessary as a haven for the Jews. It is the expression of Jewish nationalism, just like German nationalism, just like French nationalism, and ultimately, it's something that the Jews need. And we're going to have to leave it there because it is time to go. Do we have 10? Yes, we do. So we can say Kaddish Ravanan, which I'll throw up on the screen here for concluding study. So wait, I'll find it, share, and it's over here. So please rise, and it's on the screen if you need the words. Kaddish Ravanan is traditionally recited after studying. It's also recited by mourners, of course. But yes, we've concluded a passage of study. We're going to go our separate ways, and we take those words with us. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabam ve'alama tivra kiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael Bahagala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shemei Rabam varach le'alam u'lalamei alamaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shemei kudusha b'rechum le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran be'alama v'imru amen. Al Yisrael ve'al Ravanan ve'al Talmidei Hon ve'al kol Talmidei Hon ve'al kol man de'asakin ve'oraita di ve'atra hadein v'di v'chol atar ve'atar Yehi lahon ochon shalama rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin u'mzona revicha u'furkana min kodam mavon v'ishmaya v'imru amen. Yehi shalama rabba min shemaya v'chayim tovim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom miruav hu b'rachamav yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. So thank you all for joining me today. The next session is the first or second Tuesday in January. I don't have the date in front of me. Oh, actually I do. It's January 7th. Tuesday, January 7th. We're going to talk about Lillian Bloom and Pinsker. So a few more Lillian Bloom and Pinsker, later Zionist writers. And further moving on, but we're going through April, just so you know. We'll talk about Herzl, Acharam, a few others. So if you have other questions, of course, I'm sorry I didn't have a lot of time for questions, but there's so much great material that I want us all to read it. I hope you enjoyed. Have a good day, and I'll see you soon. And like I said, if anyone online wants a copy of the a hard copy of the text, let me know, and I'll make sure there's one for you at the desk. Take care.
Shkoyach.
Yeah.
Rabbi,
See you all soon.
if you wouldn't mind leaving one.
Oh,
for
I'll
me.
bring the timeline. Actually, you want a timeline? I'll give you a timeline right now. I gotta.
No, the packet.
Tried to make one.
Sorry. Say that, Paul. Say again, Paul.
If I could get a packet.
Okay, at least one packet. Great.